every faith, every ethnicity, every race, the most dynamic and compassionate civil society in the history of mankind, the establishment of religious schools and educational norms that compete with and strengthen our failing system of public education. The practical benefits of free exercise of religion are many in this great country. Now, America's diplomats are experts in the history, politics, and interests of the societies where they're posted. They should also be experts in providing evidence of the practical benefits of religious freedom, fashioned to their respective societies, culture, and as appropriate drawing on the American experience. Some of our ambassadors and diplomats have indeed engaged in this kind of diplomacy, and U.S. civil society groups inspired by RFA, like the Religious Freedom Institute and Alliance Defending Freedom, have provided to other nations evidence of religious freedom's practical benefits for them. The U.S. diplomatic establishment as a whole, I'm sorry to say, resists this approach. But the United States can't advance religious freedom on the ground if our diplomatic culture is skeptical about the validity of this right and its capacious benefits for human and social flourishing and well-being. Success requires consistency, confidence, and a sense of urgency, supported by all of our foreign affairs agencies, not just Foggy Bottom, but USAID, DOD, the White House, and the National Security Council. Unfortunately, such a commitment is at present, in my view, highly unlikely. The root of the problem showed itself in the late 1990s with that State Department claim that RFA is contrary to American interests because it implements an illegitimate hierarchy of human rights. This idea not only meant the rejection of the American understanding of religious freedom as an inalienable right, it also signaled a growing skepticism about religion itself, especially traditional religion, and its public exercise. Many diplomats believed then, and they still do, that the First Amendment conveys only a right to worship and separates religion from public life. That's both mistaken and harmful to IRF policy. Religious freedom in America exists because public religion is important to America. That's why religious freedom has never been merely a right to private worship. As I've noted, the founders guaranteed the right of free exercise of religion in private and in public. They understood this right not as perched on top of a hierarchy that diminished other rights, but their most secure guardian. That view was commonplace in America for 2 centuries. We can even see it in President Clinton's remarkable 1993 remarks when he signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I understand Greg mentioned this morning. I'm going to quote from the President's remarks. Our founders cared a lot about religion. If you heard this, memorize it, if you heard it before. Clinton, our founders cared a lot about religion. They knew that religion helps to give our people the character without which a democracy cannot survive. They knew that there needed to be a space of freedom between government and people of faith that otherwise government might usurp. It's high time, he said, we had an open and honest reaffirmation of the role of American citizens of faith, not so that we can agree, but so that we can argue and discourse and seek the truth and seek to heal this troubled land, unquote. This vigorous endorsement of religion reflected the traditional view of free exercise as a public right, a limit on the power of government, and an agent of character and virtue. With the founders, Clinton was declaring that free exercise encourages a search for truth that can unify and heal. Those views were, to say the least, inconsistent with the hierarchy claim that religious freedom threatens human rights and doesn't warrant a law requiring its advocacy in U.S. diplomacy. Unfortunately, the hierarchy claim has now sunk its roots even deeper into U.S. diplomatic thinking. In a 2021 speech, Secretary of State Blinken employed that claim to reject, officially on behalf of this administration, a report commissioned by his predecessor, Secretary Pompeo, that called for a return to the principle of inalienable rights in U.S. foreign policy. Here's how Secretary Blinken rejected inalienable rights, and I quote, "All people are entitled to human rights, no matter where they're born, what they believe, whom they love, or any other characteristic. All human rights are co-equal. There is no hierarchy that makes some rights more important than others," unquote. But if inalienable rights do not exist, and all human rights are co-equal, then those with political power can simply manufacture their own rights and coerce others to affirm them. That is the path taken by authoritarian regimes, and unfortunately it's also the path taken by the current administration. It has concluded that if religious freedom means the rejection of what it asserts to be LGBT rights, then religious freedom must be suppressed at home and abroad. And that suppression is well underway. At home, the so-called Equality Act would punish those who publicly embrace the sanctity of human life, marriage, and immutable male-female distinctions. Stunningly, that law, the Equality Act, would also deny these people the protections of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. In its foreign policy, the administration is threatening the withdrawal of U.S. aid to societies that do not accept its regime of newly constructed human rights. Thus, are URFA's goals undermined. The objection to religious freedom in the hierarchy argument, hardened by the official U.S. abandonment of inalienable rights, certainly helps to explain why our IRF policy, despite the hard work of its advocates, has not succeeded in advancing religious freedom on the ground. It's hard to sell a product in which you do not believe. Tragically, in my view, Americans no longer agree on what it means to be human, or on what human beings need to be happy, to be equal, to be virtuous, to be free. But happily, many Americans continue to embrace the founding, the founding claim that every human is created by God, and for that reason is a seeker of truth and a bearer of rights that must not be alienated by government, especially the inalienable right of religious freedom. No U.S. administration should arrogate to itself the authority or the power to punish those who continue to embrace that claim, either at home or abroad. To do so is not only to undermine the promise of RFI and its benefits to our nation and the world, it is also to repudiate what is arguably America's most valuable gift to the world, the truth claim that religious freedom for everyone is necessary for everyone. Conveying that truth in our foreign policy is a goal worthy of our nation and the world of which we are a part. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great opportunity for me. I'm Susan Yoshihara, President and founder of the American Council on Women, Peace, and Security. And it is my honor to moderate this Rockstar panel. So the first thing I'm going to do is introduce them quickly, and then we're going to move on to their talk. I'm going to introduce ladies first. Nadine Manza is the President of International Religious Freedom Secretariat and former chair of USERF. And I was watching one of your videos talk about that, about women. I think that was a really important panel that you had. Next to her, Nathaniel Hurd, whom I know from my days working in the pro-life field. He is now North America Director and Senior Fellow for Public Policy at the Religious Freedom Institute. Knox and I just met. Knox Thames is Pepperdine University's Senior Fellow, and he's directing a new program on global faith and inclusive societies here in the Washington, D.C. campus. So you wonder why, as a woman, peace, and security expert here at a religious freedom conference, and I want to thank Eric for inviting me just to give a brief pitch. Religious freedom and women, peace, and security have a lot in common. They're both laws. Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 is implemented by DOD, state, USAID, and DHS. And the purpose is very similar to RFA because it is about protecting rights and is about finding peace and stability in other countries, which is obviously a national security interest. And 3 reasons I think that we need to start merging our efforts and to catalyze one another and maybe to be more fulfilled, as Tom Farr talked about. And one is that we find that persecuted women have a double persecution. If you look at Uyghur women, Yazidi women, Catholic nuns killed in Yemen, they're killed because they're women and they're killed because of their faith. And so I think it's time we understand the nexus of that, really, in reality, right? We could help one another. The second reason is because, little known fact in WPS, most of the peace builders in WPS, our champions, are women of faith. You look at Lema Bowie in 2011, bringing peace, helping to bring peace in Liberia, obviously a lot to do with her faith. And I think we need to spend more time talking about faith in WPS. And finally, it's international. 105 nations have WPS action plans, 10 national UN Security Council resolutions. And as you all know well, this is about engaging on the ground with our partners. And it's about understanding context and working with local partners. And I think that we need a lot more understanding of religious freedom in WPS, and I think that WPS has a lot to offer religious freedom as well. So we are starting on the other end, and we're going to go in order. Please, if you have a question at the end, make it a question and come up to one of the microphones and make it brief enough that everybody has a chance to ask questions from our august panel. Over to you, Nathaniel.
Thanks, Susan. The executive branch has an addiction problem. It's a bipartisan addiction problem. For 25 years, presidents from both parties have abused the waiver authority that RFA gave to them. I'll unpack this as I speak, but in short, RFA requires the president to take action against countries after they have been designated as countries of particular concern. And for 25 years, presidents of both political parties have abused that waiver authority. As Tom mentioned just a moment ago, sanctions alone are insufficient, but they are essential. And they are essential for us to make a determination about whether the act, the RFA Act, has been effective. On the broader topic of waivers, RFA does not grant the executive branch, it does not grant the president waivers in making determinations and designations related to countries of particular concern. The law requires that the president makes determinations based solely on the facts of whether, and this is the law of the statute, the government of that country has engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom over the past year. This term, particularly severe violations of religious freedom, it's throughout the Act, and I think it's worth unpacking that. So again, back to the language of the statute. RFA defines a particularly severe violation of religious freedom as systematic, ongoing, egregious violations of religious freedom, including violations such as torture, or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges, causing the disappearance of persons by the abduction or clandestine detention of those persons, or other flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or the security of persons. We're really talking about the worst of the worst violations. When the president, who has always throughout the history of IRFA delegated this authority down to the Secretary of State, but the language of the statute is the president, so you'll hear me continuing to refer to the president. When the president designates a country as a CPC, IRFA requires the president to take one of 15 actions that are laid out in the statute or commensurate action, and to impose visa penalties, visa sanctions on the government officials that have perpetrated these violations and their family members. Think of this section of IRFA as the do something section. Do something, anything, but do something. So these presidential actions range from a private démarche, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a second, all the way up to prohibiting, this is the words of the statute, prohibiting the United States government from procuring or entering into any contract for the procurement of any goods or services from the foreign government entities or officials found or determined by the president to be responsible for violations. So going back to the sort of the bottom end of the spectrum here, the least that an administration can do, a private démarche, what exactly does that mean? So according to the Foreign Service Manual, this is a quote, "A démarche is a formal diplomatic representation of one government's official position, views, or wishes on a given subject to an appropriate official in another government or international organization. Démarches generally seek to persuade, inform, or gather information from a foreign government. Governments may also use a démarche to protest or object to actions by a foreign government," end quote. Now, the Act does include waiver authority, and there are 4 reasons that the President can give in waiving these otherwise required presidential actions. The first is national interest. The second is to further the purposes of IRFA. So a practical example would be if the president observes that a government is making progress in the area of curbing religious freedom violations, then the administration can waive sanctions. The president can waive sanctions after the United States enters into a binding agreement with the foreign government. Or the president can refer to existing sanctions. So under some other statute or authority, if the United States has imposed sanctions on this country, the president does have the latitude to say, well, we already have sanctions imposed on this country. We're not going to double up, double dip, if you will. So since 1999, when the first CPC designations were made, all the way up through 2022, the CPC designation has been applied 145 times against 17 countries, 145 times against 17 countries. And I'll quickly go through the list. So Burma, since 1999, China, since 1999, Cuba in 2022, Eritrea from 2004 through 2022, Iran since 99, Iraq in 2001 and 2003, Nicaragua, which Congressman Wolf referred to earlier this past year, Nigeria once in 2020, but it then was taken off, North Korea since 01, Pakistan since 18, Russia since 21, Saudi Arabia since 04, Sudan 1999 through 2018, Turkmenistan in Central Asia since 2014, Uzbekistan 2006 through 2017, and then Vietnam through 2004 through 2006. So Of those 145 times against 17 countries, the president has applied new sanctions against only one country, and it was 3 times. It was Eritrea in 2004, 2005, and 2006. New sanctions against one CPC 3 times. Not even a private démarche, so just a private objection or raising of concern that no one else knows about, or some kind of commensurate action. The bottom line is that by applying the waiver, almost without exception, the executive branch has fundamentally undermined and undercut the effectiveness of RFA, and it undercuts our diplomacy that is being done by to advance religious freedom. If a country, whether it's Saudi Arabia or any other country, if we're not even willing to privately engage with them about this as a private démarche, the message is very clear. We don't care. We do not care. The message is very, very clear. The problem has been so bad that in 2016, when the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, sponsored by Congressman Chris Smith, was passed, it included a sense of Congress. And the sense of Congress said this: it is the sense of Congress that ongoing and persistent waivers for any country designated as a country of particular concern for religious freedom, for engaging in or tolerating particularly severe violations of religious freedom, do not fulfill the purposes of this act. That's how seriously Congress has taken this problem. So I want to close with some recommendations. I have some recommendations for Congress and also some recommendations for the President and the executive branch. The first recommendation for Congress is a Government Accountability Office, a GAO, audit of the implementation of RFA, focusing particularly on the application of waivers. A GAO audit, a good GAO audit, should always include extensive consultation with civic groups, with civil society groups, not just with the executive branch. And it should also ascertain which parts of the executive branch have been driving this relentless application of waivers. When you look at an agency like the State Department, for example, the Office of International Religious Freedom, which does heroic work under very difficult circumstances, simply does not have the power and the clout and the heft that, for example, the regional bureaus do within the State Department. So the question is, where exactly, if we look over time, where is the push, where is the drive for the application of these waivers coming from? Is it coming from the regional bureaus? Is it coming from the National Security Council? Where exactly is it coming from? And I think a GAO audit could help uncover some of that. Nina earlier alluded to the history of the development of RFA and this debate and discussion about whether to require sanctions without waiver authority. They ultimately decided not to because, as she noted, there was a concern about the fudging of the reporting. I think given the history that I've just laid out, the time has come for Congress to reduce and consider eliminating the waiver authority that it initially gave to the executive branch, obviously consistent with the Constitution, separation of powers, and statutory precedent. Congress should also conduct full public oversight until and unless we're at a point where waiver authority is eliminated. Congress should conduct full public oversight whenever the executive branch exercises its waiver authority in the application of RFA. This is not something that should just be seen by committee staff. This is not something that should be seen in the shadows. It's something that should be out there in the light, in public hearings, and Congress needs to bring to bear all of its awesome oversight authority to bear. A last recommendation for Congress. The RFA statute it's comprehensive, but there is also latitude for legislation that complements RFA but doesn't amend RFA. And I'll give you a practical example. I spent about 7 years as a staffer at the U.S. Helsinki Commission, the Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I was a professional staffer there, nonpartisan professional staffer. And there was a problem that arose that RFA just did not seem to have anticipated. And it was embodied in Ukraine. You could argue Georgia earlier, but certainly in Ukraine. RFA only authorizes the president to consider religious freedom violations within the borders of a country for which a government is responsible. In other words, its own country. So in looking at Russia, it only authorizes the president to consider religious freedom violations within Russia itself. Where here you had a situation in which Russia had invaded another country, a sovereign country. Religious freedom violations were being perpetrated by Russian troops. In some areas, this is prior to the second invasion of Ukraine. But it was also responsible in areas that Russia was either occupying, so Crimea, or controlling through proxies under binding international law, the Geneva Conventions and beyond. It was also responsible for religious freedom violations there. And so the Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act would have explicitly authorized and required the president to consider violations in areas of Ukraine that Russia was responsible for in making that determination. These violations were happening. Clearly, the territory was not in control of the government of Ukraine. Clearly, the Russian government was responsible. So there was a piece of legislation that did not amend the underlying statute, but it came alongside and was complementary to it. The recommendations for the president and the executive branch recognize that you have an addiction and then take steps to address it. There's nothing inevitable about these application of waivers, and I think the administration, any administration, needs to recognize that this is a problem. It has fundamentally undermined our efforts to advance religious freedom around the world. If there are particular parts of the executive branch that have been driving this, curb it. If it's this office or this bureau or this department, make sure that you're addressing that. And then on a regular basis, remind the offices that are involved in determinations, designations, etc., what the law requires and what the law intends, so that the executive branch is fulfilling both the law, the letter, and the spirit of the International Religious Freedom Act. Thank you.
Wow, that was terrific. Thank you. Really gives me a lot to build on. First, I want to thank Religious Freedom Institute, Eric, Dr. Farr, the whole team for putting this day together. Such an important discussion. I'm really excited to hear all the other remarks, and thanks to the panelists and moderator for being a part of this today. As you've already heard, we've all agreed that RFA has been a huge benefit for U.S. foreign policy. Especially important was the creation, of course, of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom and USCIRF, where I was able to serve for 2 terms, ending my last year as chair. But even during my last year, 4 years, during the 4 years at USCIRF, I did see religious freedom continue to be elevated in our foreign policy and in the State Department. When I first joined in 2018, I remember the religious freedom file was always given to the lowest level person in each of the embassies, either abroad or here in the U.S. In fact, I remember one foreign service officer in one country asking us what a Baha'i was in a country where Baha'is were banned. But during those 4 years, I saw that file move up to the point that usually it was a middle to higher level person that was handling the religious freedom file. And even one ambassador to the U.S. was telling me the story how it used to be the lowest or the newest person in his office, and now he holds the file for religious freedom himself. So there has been, an elevating of foreign policy, and certainly it started, with this act, but it has continued. I find the exception to be during the most important U.S. foreign policy decisions, often those including war and religious and ethnic conflict. And so first, thank you for that framing on the CPCs. That really does help put this in context. But I did want to just note that it's important to acknowledge that religious freedom conditions globally are continuing to deteriorate. The last 5 years, reports from USCIRF have showed worsening conditions each year. And this past year, both USCIRF and the International Religious Freedom Report also, both rollouts confirm that troubling trajectory. And it's also worth noting that while the U.S. and Europe seem to be becoming less religious, according to the Pew Research Center that I know have been quoted a few times, the Middle East and Africa are becoming more religious. And they also have higher birth rates than less religious countries. So religion is going to continue to matter and must be understood carefully while determining the best way forward for U.S. foreign policy. So in my interaction with the State Department, folks, even ones that are very well versed on religious freedom to those that aren't, most would agree with this statement: religious freedom is necessary for a lasting peace. If true, a couple of facts must be acknowledged and challenged. First, why is religious freedom so often missing from the important foreign policy discussions at the highest levels? The impact of policy on religious freedom conditions and religious freedom of minority communities is still often siloed from foreign policy decisions. It's kind of a separate discussion at the kids' table. So how do we get religious freedom at the grown-up table? Second, U.S. foreign policy is often looking for a short-term win, especially in a presidential cycle. And of course, we know Iran, China, Russia, all these other countries have these 25-plus year plans, and we're like 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. How can we better prioritize the long-term view of foreign policy decisions and their impact on peace and stability? And third, in diplomacy, the priority seems to be, or often seems to be, keeping nation states happy over policies that could actually lead to a lasting peace. Think Turkey and NATO. Again, how can we emphasize the lasting consequences of foreign policy decisions over the short-term wins? So I'm going to give you some examples. China was on the cover of USCIRF's very first annual report in 1999, and as you heard, has been on the CPC list. Yet there was this belief that if the U.S. and the international community helped them become more economically prosperous, they would become better at human rights and religious freedom. Obviously, that was not the case. What if instead we had linked our support to improving conditions for religious communities? How many missed opportunities were there that led to the current situation with maybe up to 3 million Uyghurs being in concentration camps and pretty much every religious community being oppressed? In Nigeria, as you heard, the administration refuses to acknowledge religion plays a role in the horrific violence that's going on there. And of course, the Lasas administration took them off the CPC list. Of course, ethnicity and religion are often intermixed. These are very complicated situations, very complex. But taking actions that improve religious freedom conditions, regardless of why you think there's instability and conflict, is always a good thing. To exclude religious freedom from the discussions is irrational if the goal is a lasting peace. In India, we are seeing deteriorating human rights conditions that UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Fernand de Voresnes, said was massive, systematic, and dangerous during the USCIRF hearing last week on advancing religious freedom within the U.S.-India bilateral relationship. He said, quote, "India risks becoming one of the world's main generators of instability, atrocities, and violence because of the massive scale of gravity and the violations and abuses targeting mainly religious and other minorities such as Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and others. It's not just individual or local, it is systematic and a reflection of religious nationalism." It's impossible to continue to ignore the escalating violence in India and what that means for the country and for the region. Is an economic agreement and an elaborate state visit appropriate with these horrific conditions? How long does the administration ignore the religious freedom violations as Genocide Watch and the Holocaust Museum's Early Warning Project raise the alarm? In Syria, because religious freedom was not at the table, while major foreign policy decisions were being made at the start of the civil war, the U.S. supported the Syrian opposition that ended up being Turkish-led, with Islamists on the ground in northern Syria, committing horrific crimes against religious minority communities, as confirmed in reports by the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and lots of others. Some of the Islamist militias have even been sanctioned by the U.S. government over the past few years. This is a complete disconnect with the Syrian opposition leadership in the U.S. and globally, who are often exceptional people forced into this pipeline, as it was the only U.S.-approved opposition to Assad. So many of them and their families were the victims of Assad's unbelievable violence against his own people. So we failed them. Had the bar been set with religious freedom being a necessary outcome, things on the ground perhaps would not have moved so far away from where they started. Then the Syrian opposition could have been a legitimate alternative to Assad. USIRF has made recommendations to the U.S. government to support religious freedom in northeast Syria, where the autonomous administration in northeast Syria has created these exceptional conditions with religious freedom. While many are familiar with the Syrian Democratic Forces defeating the ISIS caliphate, most are not aware how they filled really those governance and security voids that were created with governance that the local people actually set up and run, that includes all religions and ethnicities, with half the leaders being women. How is this not ever included in discussions on Syria, even a part of U.S. policy for a future Syria? It's almost like 1/3 of Syria is invisible because a priority is keeping a nation state happy that borders Syria, which of course is the opposite of a policy that could bring a lasting peace. And by the way, Syria is not designated as a CPC on the special watch list. As you heard, Nigeria, Afghanistan, India, and USIRF recommends all of those. But as you heard, we do need to acknowledge the U.S. government did put Cuba, Nicaragua, CAR, and Vietnam on the CPC list last year, which was significant. And as we've talked about a lot today, that I'm going to add on is the waivers for CPC. One of the key parts of IRFA is these having some sort of punitive sanctions when you are a country of particular concern. And I'm not going to read them because you did such a nice job with that. So we talked about the countries that don't have them and how I love that addiction. I was saying that's one of the rare bipartisan agreements is to give violators a pass on religious freedom, but being addicted, I love that too. It's makes that same case. So, so with religious freedom conditions continuing to deteriorate globally, we have to admit that the old way of doing things is simply not enough. So while these are not failings of IRFA, they are, like Dr. Farr has said, really the unfulfilled IRFA, the lack of implementing IRFA effectively. And I'd also like to note that the IRFA office, along with the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, have been excellent advocates, as you heard, over the last couple decades for these things. And even the examples I mentioned, they were often not included in those conversations, or if they were, they weren't listened to. So I want to make that clear. So here are some of my recommendations, but I loved all of yours. So we should have a list of all these recommendations. First, the administration should follow their own commitment to put human rights at the center of foreign policy by making sure religious freedom is a part of every important foreign policy decision. That alone would take care of a lot of the examples that I shared. Second, the president should appoint the special advisor that is on the international religious freedom, that's on the NSC, that was also created at the time of USIRF and the Office of International Religious Freedom. Of course, President Trump had an advisor for a few years, but we haven't seen that position filled. And binding agreements, as you mentioned, are listed as appropriate for CPC countries, but are pretty much never used. IRFA says, when appropriate, make every reasonable effort to conclude a binding agreement concerning the cessation of such violations in countries with which the United States has diplomatic relations. So imagine if we had binding agreements with all these CPC countries. Imagine Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, what this would mean. And also, I think having a waiver gives the president a pass that he may not even want to take. Because what do you do? Like, no one else is going to get sanctions by giving them to you because I hate you more than the rest? He's not going to do that. So in some respects, he's never going to do it unless he has to, because then it's like, not my fault. So in some respects, Congress passing a bill like this might get signed, and it might make it so the president doesn't have to be the bad guy, because remember, diplomacy is about keeping nation states happy, so they don't fit together very well. I would say prioritize cooperative engagement with foreign governments to improve conditions when willing, as positive incentives are always better than the negative ones. You know, I use the example of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and I know these are countries that have been imperfect, but Uzbekistan was boiling people in oil when I came to USURF. So they've had tremendous advances, although there still are significant challenges. But they engaged in a roadmap process, you know, where the State Department would host with them, with civil society, USURF, and everyone came, and the UN Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, and put together actions with a timeline. And that way of approaching how to improve your conditions, imagine if we did that with Pakistan, what that could look like with the blasphemy laws, the apostasy laws. You know, so in using those tools like with India, what if we went to India and said, listen, we have to designate you as a CPC because frankly you fit the CPC, but we would rather do a roadmap with you. And I like the idea of what Frank Wolf had said about 3 years being a CPC and there's a binding agreement, because then everyone has an incentive to do a roadmap to get off the CPC list, because then they're going to get sanctions. So some of these kind of ways of making it so you're not trying to make the president be the bad guy, because it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, none of them are going to do that unless we make them. And lastly, the U.S. should be empowering and working strategically with civil society, which can do things, frankly, they cannot do. As many of you in the room are part of civil society. And like I mentioned, being a part of these roadmaps with countries, and also, you know, encouraging organizations. I know Institute for Global Engagement we've worked with have been on the ground with some of these countries working in cooperative engagement. It's been super effective. And, you know, of course, part of the reason I joined IRF Secretariat was because the effectiveness that I saw of the IRF roundtables on the ground in countries globally when I traveled, and, you know, encouraging that kind of work. I know that Ambassador Sam Brownback, you know, was as a U.S. government official, so key in empowering civil society to come to the table, to meet every week as part of the IRF roundtable, to work together with government to improve policies for the U.S. government, to raise issues happening with other governments, to put pressure where pressure was needed, and to continue to do that. We appreciate Rashad Hussain continuing to engage with IRF Roundtable and encourage civil society as well. So in closing, I think IRF has been a huge benefit in many ways, but needs to be implemented more effectively, or as Dr. Farr had said as well. And of course, if religious freedom is necessary for a lasting peace, then it needs to be at the table, and we need to be considering the impact of all U.S. foreign policy decisions on that. So thanks so much.
We're in a fight. We're in a fight for freedom, a contest of ideas around the right of individuals to form their own ideas, their own convictions. The United States has been in this battle for 25 years, advocating for religious freedom for all. It's a distinctive about who we are as a people and a great reflection of our values. And I'm proud of that as an American. I think we should all be very proud of that. And I've been proud to represent our country in this work. However, not enough countries share this commitment, and we know that so many more are actively opposed to it. But today we should honor those who did the hard work, the miraculous work of bringing IRFA about. We should celebrate what's been accomplished. The act is truly remarkable, and I think this room is remarkable, seeing people of different backgrounds, political persuasions, religious beliefs join together in joint advocacy. Of course, there'll be disagreements at times over tactics and areas of emphasis, but with a family as diverse as this, that's to be expected. But we should also remember that rooms like this aren't normal, especially in our fracturing times. This is encouraging, so we should celebrate what's been accomplished and the men and women it has saved. But we also have to look forward, continually striving to regenerate, innovate, and advocate. And I think those should be the priorities for the next 25 years, as we can't rely on mechanisms created in the last century to meet 21st century persecution. So we must continually recommit to promoting this right for all, and remember the bright spots over the past decades and learn the lessons that they provide, but also continuing to look ahead. There are steps that people and governments of goodwill can take to ensure lasting impact, We need not give up and walk away because of the enormity of the challenge, nor should we tear up the entire system. Modest fixes combined with a recommitment to consequential diplomacy can reinvigorate global efforts. So first, regenerate. We must continually reinforce and renew mechanisms created decades ago. We must continue to shine a light on abuses. The tried and true approach of naming and shaming can work. And while it's important, we also need to know that just describing the problems through reports and blacklists will not be enough alone. They won't turn the tide by themselves. So we need to actively engage persecution by bringing the full force and influence of the United States to bear, along with our partners, to spur positive change. It can work. I've seen it work. But the problem, as Nathaniel referenced, is we just don't do it enough. We don't use these tools enough. But we also need to regenerate bipartisan support. RFI's passage was a tremendous success, enjoying near unanimous support from both parties, initiatives led by Republicans and signed into law by a Democratic president. Yet we know that such political backing is a shadow of what existed in 1998. The horrors of ISIS momentarily brought the issue back to the forefront, but a sustained effort needs sustained support. We can't wait for a crisis to spur political interest, so it's incumbent upon us, the voters, to let our elected officials know that promoting religious freedom for everyone matters. And with elections on the horizons here, I would also say we need to refrain from pulling our domestic partisan debates about religious liberty into the international effort. We must zealously guard the international work, which is often life and death, from our increasingly heated debates at home. Of course, we've got to sort through these challenging domestic issues that reflect our diverse society, but there are generally higher level discussions about the finer points of individual liberties balanced against competing civil rights. I remember I was just writing about the torching of 20 churches in Pakistan and the destruction of 15 Ahmadi Muslim places of worship. We've got to guard the distinction between the domestic and the international, and I think that can help regenerate bipartisan support. Next, innovate. We've got to modernize our approach. Religious persecution may be as old as human history, but modern tools of oppression require new thinking. So while we continue to fully use the tools created in the 20th century, it's essential that we develop new approaches for the 21st century. The perpetrators of religious persecution do not rest, and neither should we. Now, many have grown frustrated, including myself, with the inability or unwillingness of policymakers to levy religious freedom sanctions on governments. I thought it was really interesting to see the rapidity of sanctions placed on Russia before and after the invasion of Ukraine, and it shows what's possible when there's political will. And so if we take our values seriously, if the words of RFI truly mean what they say, then consequences must flow when violations occur. Otherwise, we undermine our credibility and we destroy deterrence. Certainly, some persecutors may price in sanctions into their policy calculations, but other nations will take note. China watchers are certain that Beijing is paying close attention to how the West responded to Russia's invasion. And so consistently backing up our concerns with actions can create deterrence for would-be abusers. It's preventative. But I know that nothing less than actions will convince persecutors. Rhetoric alone will not work. And I think this is where the Global Magnitsky Act has been such a breakthrough in this regard, giving the United States a scalpel to target individual foreign officials to freeze their bank accounts. And even when the sanctions can't touch the individual, the second and third tier impacts can ricochet through my financial systems, hurting their cronies and supporters, while avoiding broader collateral damage. I've heard how people in China have actually avoided an act of persecution because they didn't want to be on this list. That's power, that's deterrence. So we need more ideas like this. I was recently in London with my family, and we were touring Westminster Abbey, that beautiful cathedral, that place of Christian worship for 1,000 years or more. The cathedral, if you've been through it, you see graves of eminent scholars, poets, leaders, and scientists. And of course, while looking up at the beauty of it, I happened to look down right before I stepped on the grave of the British physicist, Sir Ernest Rutherford. Now, I'm actually a fan of Sir Ernest because he was leading the charge to split the atom. And he had this famous quote, which I think applies to us. He challenged his scientists by saying, "We haven't got the money, so we've got to think. We haven't got the money, so we have to think." The oppressors have more resources than we do, so we have to think. We've got to innovate. We've got to come up with the new tools that can meet this challenge. And lastly, we've got to advocate. We've got to speak out. We've got to shine a light. We must press for change when individuals face persecution because of their religion or belief. The United States, and frankly every nation, should forthrightly voice concerns to friend and foe alike. Now, these engagements will look different when between allies and adversaries, but a steadfast and consistent message of religious freedom should be a guiding star and can be a guiding star in these turbulent times. In other words, just holistically promoting religious freedom abroad and defending the persecuted reflects the best of our values and is in our hardcore national security interests. Too often, as I know from working inside the State Department, other priorities will distract policymakers, resulting in religious freedom dropping down the priority list. The tyranny of the urgent can actually prevent the United States from responding to actual tyranny. So our advocacy must also be pointed at our own officials, continuing to insist that we maintain our prominent voice, advocacy at home and abroad. So in conclusion, people of goodwill everywhere and anywhere can help. But we also know the United States cannot and should not do this alone. There's a limit to U.S. power and influence, and this is where joint advocacy can be such a force multiplier. Sharing resource burdens and combining political capital. Collective advocacy, highlighting abusive governments from nations that cross religious, political, and geographic differences can be uniquely powerful. Likewise, civil society organizations and religious groups advocating for religious freedom for all can make a difference, like with the Earth Secretariat. Of course, while it's natural and good to advocate for your own, if you don't, who will? We know that the most stable future for persecuted co-religionists occur when everyone can enjoy freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief, and that's got to be the goal. So together we can be a force for positive change. We know the world can become a better place when we embrace religious diversity and protect the rights of all. And so while we celebrate the past quarter century, we must not let our self-applause trick us into believing the battle has been won. It continues. Millions of people suffer right now around the world for their beliefs. So what we do matters. What we do next matters. The United States must continue to lead because we are the indispensable nation in the fight for human rights. But in doing this, we should remember those who have paid a much higher price than any of us hopefully ever will, and have it inspire us to redouble our efforts. Thank you.
Well done. You kept us on time. We've got 10 minutes left for questions. So if you have a question, there is a microphone with your name on it. Do we know where that? There, the microphone's right there. And I'm not even going to take moderator's prerogative because I know we have questions for this group. All right. Please. Anyone? Yep, over here.
Testing? Okay. I'm Nathaniel Krennick, intern at Family Research Council. So I had a question sort of about like optics or tactical approach, as kind of was mentioned earlier. So regarding, I suppose, a very nuanced, specific case, like if we're regarding the Saudis, so say like an example, I think this was several years ago, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, it was like a Shiite cleric, and essentially was beheaded by Saudi authorities, as were, I think, many of his followers. Alleged to be a peaceful activist, but, the Iranians clearly were, took a lot of stake in this and, could accuse the Saudis of, civil rights abuses and whatnot. But so what my question is regarding is, just the approach in which, how do you deal with one country without, totally giving way to another or upsetting them and, in a diplomatic measure taken against that country? How do you, I suppose, have priorities, right? And so.
Very good. Yeah. How do you have priorities? And do you have that? Do you want anyone in mind, or anyone want to take that question? Nadine.
I guess that goes to the point of I was making. Is what's our goal? Is our goal a lasting peace? Is our goal peace in the Middle East, or our goal is just keeping everyone happy? For the longest time, the policy in Syria was de-escalate, enduring defeat of ISIS, and humanitarian goods. Well, that's not policy, that's tactics. Because it's almost like trying to keep everyone happy, but never creating an environment where there can be a lasting peace. That just means everyone will be quiet. You've kept everyone happy long enough to hand it to the next president, the next administration, who's still going to have the same walking on eggshells. And I think we need some leadership, but I think we need to empower the administration, whichever Republican or Democrat. Like you said, this is bipartisan in terms of having these kind of issues, with laws that make it easier for them to stand up to countries so they just don't look like the bad guy. Because right now they look like the bad guy. If they're going to take on Saudi after not taking Saudi on for all these years, then they're going to probably cut off communication with our administration, and now we've got a problem. So yeah, I think we need to have tougher laws so that our administration is forced to take actions against them in those situations. And yeah, it is complicated. I mean, whenever we're dealing with Shias in the Middle East, you always are they representing, Iran? And so, you have to think through that. So I really have to be specific on that situation. But I do think we need to be looking at these things differently. We need to empower the government to be able to be stronger without having to be blamed for it.
One other thing I would just add is that on the question of upsetting, there are country-to-country relationships, but then there are also personal relationships. And I think one of the biggest challenges, Tom mentioned earlier, some of the challenges for the diplomatic corps is that, you're a diplomat, you engage with your interlocutors from another country, you develop relationships with them, and, look, no one wants to be disliked. We all have this very human compulsion to be liked, to be affirmed, to be respected. But at the end of the day, if you were to ask, before they become diplomats, if you ask most people who enter into the Foreign Service, why did you become a diplomat? The answer is not so I can avoid upsetting people. The bottom line for members of the Foreign Service, as well as other people that are representing the United States abroad, is what are America's interests, and somewhat expansively and broadly defined, and what is the foreign policy of the current administration, and reference to the Constitution. There are a lot of factors that go into this, but at the end of the day, that has to be the driver, and there are going to be times where we have to make policy decisions that may upset one's interlocutors or may upset another country, but there are overriding interests at stake there.
I would just add, I think the United States, we're the world's largest economy, we're the world's strongest military, and we use our leverage very poorly. So the question was, would this upset them? I think really the question should be, wouldn't they be worried that it upsets us? And if our values were really, truly integrated into our foreign policy, then there'd be consequences for when partners upset us. And I think this goes across administrations. We don't leverage our influence effectively, especially on our values, and it's a detriment to our credibility.
Excellent. We have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone here.
Hi, my name is Avery Bolsowitz, and I work for the Beckett Fund. A main question that I have is that American domestic affairs has kind of become a Tower of Babel, where it's not just we're unwilling to hear each other out, it seems like we no longer understand one another. So how do you guys propose that we can both come together and not be separated by an aisle, but we can be centralized under one central point on foreign policy?
Okay, she threw you a softball right there at the end. Who wants to take this one on?
I've written about this issue where I think looking to focus on violent persecution abroad can be a rallying point. I wrote an article for USA Today about when I was at the State Department, I would see very similar situations for Christian converts, atheists, and members of the LGBT community in the Middle East. And those are three communities that do not interact. Their advocates do not interact. And here in the U.S., they're often opposed to each other. But the drivers of persecution for each of those communities are basically the same kind of mentality, legal, social. And could that be a starting point to at least build a common approach based on human dignity? We don't have to agree on everything, but we can agree that people shouldn't be jailed or murdered for what they believe or how they love. Could that be a starting point that could then reverberate back to our domestic debates and maybe lower the temperature a bit?
I mean, just extending that a little further and picking up on some of Lewis's comments earlier today. I mean, I think ultimately it's focusing on what makes us human. One of the things that we talk a lot about at the Religious Freedom Institute is that being religious is fundamentally human, the desire. I mean, we have these big existential questions. We look for answers outside of ourselves to some other source for meaning and a path on how to live. So I think, keeping the focus on what it is that makes us human, because at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of this, the violence against religious people, violence of other kinds as well, it's wrapped up in dehumanization. It's setting aside the fact that this is a fellow human person with a personality and a story and an inherent human dignity, and reducing them to something else. So I think just really keeping the focus on what is human. But that said, I mean, a lot is made about polarization in the United States and polarization abroad. I'm of the view that to some extent that's it's overstated, in so much as there are certain things that are true, there are certain things that are good, and those are things that are worth fighting for. And when you do that, you're always going to upset people. There are always going to be people that are made angry by that, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that. You should still be pursuing those things, even if there are people that are put off by it.
I was going to say at USURF, it was really I had a wonderful 4 years. Thankfully, the team, Aaron was executive director the whole time, so it was a really wonderful experience. And it really was the most bipartisan place in Congress. And there's a New York Times article, if you haven't read it, that you should Google, about Tony Perkins, the president of FRC, and Anarima Bhargava, a George Soros fellow, becoming pretty much best friends. That's fair. And they even went to the border together to see the border crisis. And, these are two people you probably would never interact with each other, except they were sitting on this at USURF, and we had an LGBT report that came through, and that the two farthest people in the polls kind of got together a weekend and rewrote it, and we were able to get that out. And so I think bringing the people together, it doesn't always have to be to talk about religious freedom. Sometimes our kind of the multi-faith work we do in some of these countries could be something that's not religious related, but then people get to know each other and find out the humanity of each other, and that they don't have horns, and they could actually work together. And so I do think we need a lot more concerted efforts to bring communities together, to know one another, and be able to work together. And that's really what the Earth Roundtables globally are founded on. I mean, we just did one in the World Parliament of Religions in August, and it was so interesting because they do a lot of interfaith work. So you think they'd be used to this, but they weren't used to the multi-faith work, where a Christian spoke a woman from India about the horrific violence in Manipur her own community had experienced. And then at first everyone is like, well, this is happening, and why isn't this in the news? Because of course it's not in the news. And then, a Muslim from Ahmadiyya starts speaking, and then they're standing with the Christian, and afterwards these people that have been doing interfaith work for years come up to me like, what was that? Because now you have all these religions standing for each other, like you mentioned. It's so powerful when one stands for the other, and they're all standing for each other, and getting to know each other and finding out that they all share that same humanity. And then they're a more powerful group when they're advocating together. And so, I certainly think that model in the United States is definitely needed.
I can't think of a better note to end on from that difficult question. This panel certainly did a great job answering it. So please help me to thank this panel and get ready for the next one. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. She's taking my picture. Got it? Good. Susan Yoshihara.
Susanna Abadi. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm originally from Iran, and I work on the Small Pacific